Very good morning, everyone. Are we ready for this very exciting panel on global risks? So the question is the world ready and prepared to deal with global risks? The world is interconnected, but so are our global risks. It has, and they can have, cascading effects, as we've seen from the financial crisis. They cross borders, they're transnational. They require different stakeholders to come together in order to deal with them. But at the same time, they can also undermine trust that makes it difficult for collaboration when it is most needed. And decision makers in all sectors are struggling to understand the complexities together with many of the interlinkages in our new normal. So we have before us 4 very exciting experts to highlight for us what they see from their perspective as very significant global risks today, some of the causes and some of the cascading effects, and also how best to address them. So what I'm going to do is to start immediately. We only have 1 hour. And my first person will be on my right, Bog Jeremic. He is the former foreign minister of Serbia and is currently the president of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. But he was also the president of the 67th session of the United Nations General Assembly. So, Vog, let me start with you and ask you that in today's world, geopolitics and the links between geopolitics and geoeconomics have come back on the agenda. And this, in a sense, have undermined quite a bit of trust when it's most needed in terms of global governance and how best do we deal with it. And the undermining of global governance, in a sense, makes it also very difficult for the international community to deal with other issues, such as the resolution of conflicts, the non-state actors, the humanitarian crisis that we see, even internet governance and climate change. When you were the president of the GA, you talked about the rule of law and the need to focus on that, and also about effective multilateralism. Are they at breaking point? What do you see as some of the new issues and significant risks that are emerging, and do we have systems to deal with them? It's all yours.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here in Singapore. Thanks for the kind introduction. Yesterday, I was answering the same question on a TV station, and they asked me, what's the current state of affairs in global governments? And then that reminded me of the answer that Secretary Gorbachev once gave at a press conference. He was asked, in one word, Mr. Secretary, what's the condition of the Soviet economy? And he said, in one word, good. And they say, okay, well, Mr. Secretary, well, how about in 2 words? 2 words? Not good. So I am afraid that the situation with the global governance is much more the latter. And I think we live in an era in which geopolitics and geoeconomics you can no longer talk about how one influences the other. They're actually merging into one single category. And the illusions of the end of history came to a crushing end sometimes during the last decade. And I think that we live in a world right now that is increasingly complex, that is increasingly dominated by the geopolitical theaters of friction, in particular with what is happening in Europe and the European neighborhood. And when I talk about Europe, I also relate to the European crisis and the Western crisis in general with Russia. Then the Middle East, but I understand that here are people who know much better about the Middle East than I do, and also what's going on in this part of the world. So I think that in the coming few years, we are going to see economic trends increasingly depending on how the politics of these three theaters evolve and how do they end up influencing each other. One serious problem in the global governance is that the institutions of global governance do not seem to be coping very well with the pace of change in the real world. And when such thing happens, then the tendency is for people to just start looking into other ways and start doing things their own way, or start creating new institutions that not necessarily involve everybody. Yesterday, we had a little discussion about the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and some people did argue that who knows what would have happened if the World Bank and the IMF were reformed earlier in a way that perhaps more reflects the realities of today's economics. The key multilateral institution, the United Nations, the only organization of universal membership and universal legitimacy in the world, with all its shortcomings, it's the only multilateral institution that we have. And we're not going to make another universal one anytime soon. Well, that institution doesn't seem to be coping too well and doesn't seem to be catching up with what's going on in the world right now. That is a reason to be worried, not just in the world of politics, but very much so in the world of economics.
Thank you very much, Volk. Let me continue this discussion of geopolitics and turn to you, Professor Huang. So Professor Jin Huang is currently professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Asia and Globalization, the Center of Asia and Globalization, and a major expert on Chinese politics, foreign relations, as well as Asia-Pacific security issues. Now, Professor Huang, let's reflect a little bit about risks that is emerging in our seas. And this is the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. Can you provide us with a more nuanced, complex understanding of how to navigate through these very rough waters? And where do you see as some of the ways of moving forward?
Yeah, to understand this issue, you have to understand the big picture first and see what's the fundamental reason for all those so-called troubles in South China Sea, East China Sea, and in the Asian Pacific. Let me show you one slide. Slide number 1, please. Of course, let me make 3 points very quickly. Number 1, the reason for all of this. Number 2 is the importance of South China Sea right there. And number 3 is the dispute and the future solution. The reason for this is very simple. That is China's rise. We know that the entire center of gravity of economic, diplomatic, even security activities of the world has been shifted to this place we call Asia Pacific. And China's rise has changed the landscape in the region. And China's rise has to be understood in 2 dimensions. Dimension number 1 is that ever since People's Republic of China was established in 1949, China has for a long time did not have any capability or capacity to go out, have a strong army for sure, but very weak navy, very weak air force, and eyesight is also very short. So in other words, China really did not have any capability to control or manipulate the situation around its country in the neighborhood. But this sense has vastly changed. Ever since the beginning of this century, China's military build-up, China's overall capacity increased dramatically. So all of a sudden, China has a capability to go out, to really manipulate and control the situation in the neighborhood, especially in South China Sea. 1 dimension. 2nd dimension, of course, China's rise is achieved by integrating itself into international system. As a result, here we have established or created a China-centered orbit of economic activities. Chinese economy has been deeply integrated into regional economy as well as world economy. So that's another reason. Because of that, of course, all the countries around China are feeling the pressure of this rise. And that's a fundamental reason for why we have that pressure here. Japan, countries in Southeast Asia. And second, about South China Sea, we know that a fundamental lesson learned during World War II between the United States and Japan, of course, China, is that whoever controls South China Sea controls Western Pacific, period. It is not for so-called oil or energy or fish. It's simply for strategic stability for China's sake or for America's sake. For the Chinese, South China Sea matters the national security. If you're interested, I can give you more details in question and answer. For United States, of course, it also matters not only U.S. dominance in Pacific, which has become American lake after World War II, but also matters for America's strategic credibility. Can you imagine if United States of America fails to stand up against China in South China Sea or East China Sea? Then let me quote a very senior officer from the United States. I don't want to mention his name. He said, if we fail to stand up here, our credibility, the confidence in us, United States, will go down the drain. So that's the issue. And so it's very important. And last point, of course, slide number 2 is about the dispute. If you look at it, you know that the so-called solve the issue according to international law is a joke. Because according to international law, there's so much overlapping there. The red line is what Philippines claims. The yellow line is Malaysia. The blue line is Brunei. And the brown line there is Vietnam. And of course, the kind of U-shape we call 9-dash line is by China. And so if we, according to international law, we will never ever have a solution. So the only solution that is possible is achieved through negotiation. But negotiation requires balance. But here we have a asymmetry of power here. China is so much bigger, so much stronger than the rest of it. So that's where the problem is. That's why all the countries in the region want the United States to be here to balance out China. But that's a problem because that involves 2-level games in the South China Sea. Level 1 is between United States and China. That's a leverage game. Let's be frank about it. It's about bargaining. And level number 2, of course, is a territory dispute. So the end of it, given the asymmetry of the power in the region, given the United States and China, both of them see fundamental interests in this region, at the end of it, in the near future, South China Sea issue is an issue for management. There's no solution. Essentially, it depends on the stability of the relationship between United States and China.
Thank you very much, Professor Huang. Let me now turn to my left and continue with the issue of negotiation. And recently, we had a successful nuclear deal with Iran. Can you reflect, Pranak, a little bit on the basically the repercussions of that deal for the Middle East, for the West, and of course for China, including for Asia, especially India and China.
Absolutely.
But also the geopolitics of declining oil prices, and also the implications of that for many of the climate change issues that we're discussing as related to fossil fuel. Let me just say that Pranak Khanna is the managing partner of Hybrid Reality, global strategist, and also the global correspondent for CNN. So you have the floor.
Thank you, thank you. Well, you mentioned a couple of points that are deeply interconnected, the Iran deal, oil commodities prices and so forth, and we're starting to get better at forecasting what those connections are. But I noticed yesterday that quite a few panelists began with stories, so let me share a brief one that I think illustrates how interconnected these risks and challenges are. In the summer of 2010, I found myself on a leisurely drive of about 11,000 kilometers from London to Mongolia in a very heavy truck. And as we were crossing southern Siberia, we found ourselves in a grotesque heat wave. So we don't normally associate Siberia with heat waves, but of course that's exactly what was going on. Forest fires were raging across Russia at the time, and Russia had to ban wheat exports for the first time. So we got ourselves no air conditioning, through this and reached Mongolia. 6 months later, the Arab Spring broke out. Now, only in retrospect did we pay attention to the fact that Russia was the largest source of Egyptian wheat imports. But now we realize that, in fact, there is a historical pattern of commodities or food staple price volatility and political unrest. So it takes us time, to piece these things together, but we see that even over a short term or medium term, there are interconnections, and we tend to associate these ripple effects and volatility and complex interconnections with financial markets. Asian financial crisis, or trade, what's happening today with the Chinese slowdown and its impact on commodities exporters. But in geopolitics too, we have these cycles and connections as well. And I think it's worth realizing that even in geopolitics, we really are all price takers. We've become price takers as we are in markets. I'm sure those of us who woke up early this morning and saw the Fed's sort of dovish decision have realized that, even with stronger numbers in the US, there's concerns about what's happening abroad in emerging markets in China, and even potentially what China is going to do with its treasury holdings, and the impact that had on the Fed's decision. So we live in this very, very complex world, and we're only now starting to be able to piece together in retrospect, but still not proactively in advance, what the consequences are of things that are happening today. So that brings me to Iran, where you can see both opportunities for de-escalation and progress, because of course we have a deal, right? We a couple of years ago, I'm sure you recall John McCain, the American senator, saying bomb, 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 bomb. We don't exactly hear that anymore, which is a good thing. On the other hand, what are the negative possibilities that could emerge from what on the surface appears to be a very positive trajectory? Well, first of all, since the 2013 Joint Plan of Action, November 2013, there's a clear divergence now between what the Europeans are doing, which is, of course, lifting sanctions more sort of enthusiastically than the US. Asia, except for China, has been much more cautious and waiting to see what the US does. China has all along been much more sort of willing to engage economically and otherwise with China and Russia as well. So there's a clear divergence now in terms of the policy approach to Iran. The U.S. debate has moved from containment and sanctions towards cautious engagement and deterrence. They're very worried that even if in the medium term or long term you can slow an Iranian program, the engagement with Iran and the economic opening of Iran is going to provide the country with the resources to accelerate aggressive destabilizing measures in the rest of the region, from Yemen to Lebanon. And that may indeed be the case. We'll have to see how that plays out. One scenario is that we return to the 1980s. And the 1980s was the Iran-Iraq war, a Sunni-Shia war as it was characterized then, but with Saudi Arabia playing the role of Iraq, and Iraq itself being the battleground, much as it was, in fact, in the 1980s. So we can really turn back to the clock, the 1980s. There was one added complicating factor that's worth talking about. In as much as Iran is spreading its networks, also infrastructural and trade, particularly with India, China, and around the region, but that's ISIS. So now you have a situation where not only might you return to the 1980s, Sunni, Shia, Iran, Saudi, Iran sort of conflict, but you have ISIS in the middle destabilizing every single country in the entire Near East. So that's not only a global security situation because of terrorism and the effects that it's having in potentially regimes falling, but it affects all of us in a very direct, personal way that I thought I would flag for all of you, and that is our own personal mobility and how we travel. Because what the ISIS phenomenon is doing is literally erasing, gradually, in some cases quickly, the advantage that the passport you hold has. You may be a Norwegian, you may be an American, you may be Canadian or from New Zealand. You have enjoyed the privilege of traveling visa-free all over the world, and there has been a clear hierarchy of countries in terms of who has the most visa-free mobility. What ISIS is doing with its ability to recruit people who may appear to be completely innocuous is erasing that advantage. So now we will probably find ourselves within the next several years, certainly 5 years, 10 years, providing a lot more personal data about ourselves as individuals. You will no longer be able to hide behind or simply have this advantage conferred upon you by your nationality, your ability to travel everywhere. So in some ways this is interesting because it may level the playing field. A Nigerian or a Pakistani or a Saudi citizen who has trouble getting visas everywhere, if he's willing to provide data about himself sufficiently, he may be able to travel as visa-free as someone who has a Western passport. So I think that's something that's worth considering as the ISIS effect unfolds. Just a last quick point about energy. This is an area, of course, where the U.S. has been able to set the pace with shale oil and gas. The Saudi maneuvers to drop prices have not sufficiently crippled the industry as was intended. I think one thing that we can be certain of, despite all global risks, is the structural low in energy prices. That's a debate that some people are having. My position is that we really have crossed from the debate about peak oil to the reality of peak oil demand, which means, of course, that prices are structurally low. That is very bad news for Venezuela, Nigeria, Saudi, Iran, Russia in various measures. What I've seen now in recent travels to both Saudi Arabia and Iran is that both countries realize just how rapidly they have to diversify their economies. So one can't say exactly which countries are going to experience political risk or volatility the fastest as a result of structurally low energy prices, but I do see in both of those key swing producers, Saudi and Iran, a serious wake-up call and realization that they have to diversify a lot more rapidly than they had planned to.
Just let me press a little bit because it's all over our television screen. And this is the fact that collapsed states and the dangers of non-state actors like ISIS have made it almost impossible for people to live in their communities and leading to this massive, they call it a migration crisis, but actually it's a crisis of displacement. We have today 60 million people who are displaced, the largest number and the biggest humanitarian crisis after the Second World War. Now, given what Volk has also discussed, and this is basically the inability for many of our institutions to deal with this crisis, how do you think this could be resolved besides the protectionist and the fortress wall approaches that is also being developed?
Migration is one area where we would like to see some kind of global solution or global compact in the same way that we do with climate change and the environment. But as you can see, just in the context of Europe, let alone the variable migration policies in Asia, North America, and elsewhere, there will not be, perhaps ever, one common standard or norm for how countries handle migration. And again, just within Europe, you see the divergence in policies right now. So what we do see, though, is permanent dislocation of X millions of people. And you can only imagine over the period of decades rather than a few years. Really, you have to think in terms of decades, in terms of how and when certain populations will be willing to repatriate. So this is a long-term structural demographic situation for European countries primarily to deal with. They originally thought that North Africa was their main concern. Or in fact, in Germany in the 1990s, it was Turkey and Kurdistan that was their main concern. And then North Africa, and now it's also the Arab countries. So this is a wave of either economic or political or geopolitical crises that are causing successive geographic flows into Europe. And it's something that they have to deal with a very long-term strategy, and they haven't come up with that yet.
Let me ask one more question, and anyone from the panel before I come to James could take this on. Next week, 150 heads of states will be coming to New York to the General Assembly. And the issue there is sustainable development, climate change. Now, with the falling oil prices, fossil fuel will still be very much at the center, and therefore the implications of that for the sustainable development agenda. And how do you think, especially now the relationship between China and the US, and really those two countries coming together for the first time to lower greenhouse gas emission, how do you think that would play out in the next couple of years? Maybe with you first, Pranak, and then maybe Volk, if you can say a little.
Sure. I mean, the fact that there is a combination of peer pressure and strategic interest in both countries' part leading to a bit more of a sort of engaged approach on climate change, that's of course very welcome. But that said, even without that taking place, in both countries we see substantial efforts around energy diversification, around innovation in energy production technologies and so forth. So I think that there are positive trends irrespective of what we see on the diplomatic level, which is again non-binding, very long-term, very difficult to implement and to monitor. So I would be much more interested in us seeing not only the technological investments and technology transfer and the funding mechanisms around that, more than just seeing kind of these sort of diplomatic agreements where we're not sure whether they'll really be followed up on in the short term.
Volk, would you like to say something?
Well, I agree with this, but I would not underestimate the need for coming to a treaty, coming to an agreement. And I'm talking about Paris. I'm talking about December, the climate change summit in Paris. The Sustainable Development Agenda was put together, and this is just going to be approved in New York in September, in a couple of weeks from now. But I think that the Paris Treaty is something that I wouldn't, just take too lightly. I wouldn't take it too lightly as yet another diplomatic piece of paper. We are lucky enough that the key players, and I refer to the United States and China in particular, are right now in the mode to make this possible. And I agree that it's not going to be formally binding, but it is going to be a great test of our times as to whether the commitments made in the Paris Treaty are going to go through the same fate as the ones that were put down in Kyoto. I think that we no longer have the privilege, no longer have the luxury of letting it go down the drain like the Kyoto. And I think, again, that there is going to be a big task for whoever gets to be the one that enforces and monitors this implementation, and in all likelihood it is going to be the United Nations. So I go back to this old diatribe about whether or not we're ready or whether or not we do have effective multilateral institutions capable of doing it. I hope we do, because I don't think that we're going to have another opportunity, not in this generation and perhaps not in the lifetime of this planet.
Professor Huang, you wanted to say a few words?
Before we do this, let's get the facts right. We know that each American consume about 500 gallons of gas each year. Chinese, barely 45. Indians, not even in the 20-something. So you see the fact. The fact number two is that about 5 years ago, either China or Indian were nowhere to be seen in terms of winter or solar power and wind power. But now China is the #1 producer in both solar power and wind power. And India is #2 and #3. And the third fact is that talking about government subsidies to solar power and wind power, it is not developed countries at all. It's China and India. China is #1, India is #2. So you're going to see that on this issue, I think it really depends on two largest developing countries who are leading the third wave of modernization are doing this. They're doing this not for anybody else, for themselves. Because people always ask me, what is one thing that can derail entire China's development? I'll tell you, it's a massive environmental disaster. And Chinese leaders realize that they have to do this. That's for sure. And going to the oil price, that's a bad news. The oil price dropped. It should be good news for China and India because they both consume a lot of oil. But the bad news because it makes solar power and wind power more expensive. Another bad news is, we know, I just mentioned very briefly here, it could lead another financial crisis by the year of 2018 to 2020 because every penny in the shale gas and shale oil was borrowed. Every penny. How much of it? $5.8 trillion. And why Saudis still pumping oil like crazy when American dollar is strong, when demand is flat? Because they want to wash out the oil, the shale gas, shale oil. That's a strategy. And by if you keep doing that, in 2 or 3 years, all the shale oil, shale gas will be in deep, deep trouble because we have invested so much into it, and every penny again is borrowed. And those debt, especially junk bond, began to mature in 2018. We're going to have another crisis. So I think a major issue for Xi Jinping's visit to the United States a few days from now is talk about how United States and China, first and foremost, to maintain financial stability in the next 5 or 10 years.
That's the very good way of leading to you, James. James McGormack is the global head of the sovereign and supranational rating, Fitch rating company. Let me talk and focus you on just what you have just heard, the return of a financial crisis. Is there a threat of a next financial crisis? We're talking about economic and financial risks. Risky bubbles are not the only thing. We've just heard about falling commodity prices, especially oil. Shadow banking, where are we on that? Where is the world in terms of recovering and sustaining economic growth, especially at a time when China is declining? China has been the center of gravity of the global economic recovery after the 2008 financial crisis. But now with all the rebalancing, with the devaluation of the yuan, the slower growth rate, can we depend on China? What else in terms of sustaining and finding new drivers of growth?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, there's a lot of issues there, and seems to be a lot of things to kind of worry about. You know, it's a question that we get asked a lot. I guess everybody asks themselves a lot, you know, what is the next global financial crisis? What's it going to look like? And the sense is always that, you know, it's going to be different. It's going to be something that we haven't expected. But the reality this time around is it might be quite similar to the one we just had, because debt levels are still too high. And that's something I think we can say definitively almost everywhere in the world. And if you look at, say, the United States, where the country that brought us into, I guess, the global financial crisis, and if you look at debt levels there, and this is public sector and private sector, so corporates, households, banks, and government, and you look at the debt ratios over long periods of time, they've pretty much gone straight up, and a slight interruption with the global financial crisis. So there was some kind of modest deleveraging in the US, but not much, and now the country continues to sort of lever up. In Europe, we don't have the history going back quite as far in terms of the numbers, but you see a similar pattern historically where as economies go through different cycles, what happens is government debt tends to ratchet up, but it never actually comes back down again, you know, when times are good. So you have this increasing debt burden in the advanced economies. And now we have the same phenomenon across a lot of emerging markets. And if you look at just one aspect of the debt in emerging markets, you see that the foreign currency bonded debt, which is what we kind of focus on, as recently as 2010 in emerging markets, that total outstanding debt was around $1 trillion. Now in 2015, it's 1.8 trillion. That's a huge increase in a relatively short period of time. So yesterday we didn't have a Fed rate hike, but you know, what happens when we do? And I guess the risk really is not what the Fed does, but what longer term interest rates do. Because the last time we had an interest rate increase by the Fed, we had this so-called conundrum that Alan Greenspan referred to, where short-term rates went up and longer-term rates really didn't. So the cost of debt service didn't really change that much. So there wasn't the incentive to kind of reduce debt levels. If this time around we do have a Fed rate hike eventually and longer-term rates do move up, then debt levels are higher than they've ever been. So we could be looking at a very similar kind of scenario in terms of financial crisis the next time around is what we've just been through. You mentioned China. I guess we're in Asia. We have to talk about China and the growth prospects there. You know, the sessions that I was able to attend yesterday, I didn't really hear anyone talk about a hard landing in China. Nobody really talks about hard landing anymore. It's the consensus seems to be that we will have this very gradual sort of glide to slower growth. That's our view as well, but if we're here to talk about risks, then I think one of the risks is that you get a bumpier landing, you get a harder landing in China. And you know, when people are talking about the Fed and the last Fed rate hike, the anecdote that people tend to use is it was so long ago, you know, that iPhones didn't exist, right, when the Fed last had a rate hike, which sounds like it's kind of in your grandfather's era or something like that, you know. But the last time that China grew by 5%, less than 5% on an annual basis, it was a $400 billion economy. It's now a $10 to $11 trillion economy. So a sharp slowdown in China is much more meaningful now than it was the last time we saw growth of 5%. And just one last point, given that we're in Southeast Asia, I think, let's say China does manage a gradual slowdown in growth, and it does manage to have a transition in terms of the growth factors. So it moves away from this investment-led, export-oriented growth to consumption-led, service-oriented growth, at a lower growth rate. Well, much of the rest of Asia is kind of leveraged to that old China model. Not so much in North Asia. I think there's, if you look at Korea or Japan or Taiwan, they've invested a lot in China, and their exports to China are a variety of different products, both intermediate products and final goods products, so selling directly to Chinese consumers. In Southeast Asia, it's more of the model is more fitting into this global supply chain strategy, feeding inputs into the Chinese export machine, which eventually the final products were exported to the US and Europe. So what happens if China is successful in moving away from that export orientation? How does the rest of Asia leverage off the new China sort of growth model? You hear a lot of discussion about the change in growth and the intended change in growth in China itself, but you don't really hear that being discussed in other countries in Asia. And one worry would be that there are a couple of countries in Southeast Asia that already have, and I'm not talking about Singapore, but that already have some concerns about being caught in what's called the middle income trap, where you reach a certain level of income, but you can't kind of move beyond that because you're not moving into higher value exports, and you're being squeezed at the lower end by countries like Vietnam, which are cheaper to produce the low end kind of exports. So I guess it's probably Malaysia and Thailand that spring to mind. So I guess even with a no sort of hard landing scenario in China, there are still risks associated with a different kind of growth in China, and whether the rest of Asia is able to leverage off of that as successfully as they leveraged off the old China growth model.
In a sense, if you look at what is also happening, taking into account this is 2015, and we're talking about the possibility of creating by the end of the year the ASEAN Economic Community as a way of generating more regional markets so that it's not highly just dependent on the export market of the G3 countries, but increasingly trying to increase and deal with the issues of unemployment and inequality in many emerging markets. Because if we are going to have the change from the export growth model to the consumer growth model, of course, you need to have income security before people can actually spend. Now, given that model, do you think, I tend to think that it's not really a displacement of the export model to the consumer model, but a mix of that together with a mix of services. How do you think that would play out?
Well, sure. I mean, there's, you can't talk about these things in a vacuum. I guess initiatives like ASEAN are obviously to be applauded. I mean, I've always been personally a little bit skeptical just because the countries in ASEAN are so different in terms of their income levels, and Singapore is very small, which is at the high end, and really if you want to develop the other countries in ASEAN by greater integration, you would want the wealthiest country to be quite a large one that the others can kind of export to. I guess the other issue to kind of throw into the mix is demographics, right? Because we can all talk about consumption or consumption-led growth, but if the demographics are kind of going the wrong way, then there are certain there are limits to that growth model as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that's the whole issue of aging population.
Sure.
and all that. Well, you've heard the panelists. We have about 15 minutes, and I would like to open it up for you to ask panelists any question that you like. We can take a couple of questions and then get the panelists to answer. And yes, could you introduce yourself?
Morning, thank you. My name is Ivan Vashko from Algebris. I guess my question is for Parag and Vuk, but I'd love to hear the professor's thoughts as well, and anyone who wants to pitch in. On your travels and your conversations, have you come across any sensible suggestions of how to deal with the impending refugee crisis? Because Europe could get run over very, very quickly. Maybe it's happening now, and maybe in sort of in Parag's example, we'll look back on this in 6 months' time or 12 months' time and figure out that this was a lightning rod for a much bigger problem, because it seems to me the discussion is very one-sided and no one really has any clue on how to approach it. So I'd love to hear some thoughts, even some really adventurous suggestions. Thanks.
All right. Any other question? We'll take two. Okay, if not.
There's a gentleman there.
Yeah. Please.
James Lee, we are an investment bank based in China. I have a question about, last night AIB did a big presentation. Honestly, I have a pretty deep question because from my own experience, I work in the private sector, and my experience in seeing how these government-owned entities' effectiveness, has been very mixed. I mean, do you guys really believe AIB can really have an impact since it is owned by these governments who are motivated probably more than by, economic returns? And yesterday's discussion, there's a big chapter about, nobody asked the question about corruption, but somehow Mr. Jim talked so much about his expertise in preventing corruption, and I found it very amusing. So I don't know what's your take on really the effectiveness of this new thing, which sounds grand.
Okay, so we have two questions. So let's take the first one on migration. But actually it's even beyond migration. It is about refugees and displacement.
Well, I'm going to take a first crack because I come from Serbia, and Serbia is actually deeply affected by the crisis. And as a matter of fact, all the dramatic pictures that you could see in the last few days, they actually come from the Serbia-Hungary border, which is the border of the European Union. Serbia is not in the EU, and Hungary is in the European Union. As of last night, we have basically Serbian-Croatian border in flames as well. I think this is probably the largest and the most serious crisis that the European Union is facing since the beginning of the steel and coal community. And this is not going to go away. It's only going to become worse given the dynamics of the situation in the sources of this. And this is in the Middle East. Things are not going to get any better anytime soon, and there is no decisive action that one can envisage in the coming months with regard to what's going on in the Middle East. So in that sense, the situation is only going to be more and more complicated at the source. At the destination, inside Europe, I think this is where the crisis management, and this is where some very, very, very bold steps would need to be taken. And I'm a little optimistic in this regard because of a very decisive stance of Germany right now. I think that Germany is really showing leadership under the current circumstances, and Chancellor Merkel in particular. I think we're talking about 1 to 2 million people which will have to be dealt with in the coming 12 months. And there's absolutely no way to deal with it except spreading it out in a way. We'll see what is the way, what is the fair way throughout the whole European Union. There is very strong opposition to this idea in certain parts of Europe, especially Central East part of Europe, but I think that this will be overcome. There were difficult moments with regard to the Greek crisis a few months ago, but this was overcome, and I think that in the same way, this is going to be overcome in the coming months, provided Germany stays the course. My bets in that sense are on Merkel, but it'll have to be a Germany-driven solution in which Germany is going to be probably taking about 1/2 of the entire refugee mass, but the rest of the European Union will have to take their part and have to share the burden too. Otherwise, we're going to see very, very serious destabilizing, political destabilizing, institutional destabilization of the European Union.
What Germany is doing certainly is buying time for the rest of Europe to come up with a collective strategy, if there can be one. Earlier I said I don't think there will be, but that said, other countries will at least realize that they need to do more and create the space, physically and politically for that to happen. I was in Berlin with Foreign Minister Steinmeier just a couple of weeks ago, the day before he announced that the number would go up to about 1 million, which is more than 1% of Germany's population, an increase in just 1 year's time, solely on the basis of the number of refugees who are coming in. They then a couple of days later announced that Tempelhof Airport, now no longer in service anyway, would become a camp, and then there's towns in East Germany that are going to be used. Across Europe, there are, because of the demographic crisis that Europe faces, irrespective of the migration crisis, there are, there are real estate opportunities here, for lack of a better term, for accommodating migrants from the southern rim, wherever they may come from. And I think that each country is going to come up with its own strategy. There's moral arguments, there's also economic arguments and demographic arguments around using these refugees in the short or medium term or otherwise to help to stimulate a certain amount of economic activity within countries. That said, what Europe has known for a long time, way before the Arab Spring, is that the only constructive long-term solution is promoting development, modernization, stability in the countries of North Africa and the Middle East. And I've seen this in Morocco, in Libya, in Egypt, and Tunisia over the last 10 years, where Europe has made very, very small investments in the kinds of job creation, economic development, supply chain kinds of initiatives that have and can create jobs for locals and train locals and convince them to stay in their own countries. But it was too little then, and then it was more or less switched off, and it's obviously way too little now. But in the long run, what we know is that that's the only thing that works. And the proof of that is, again, countries like Turkey and Mexico. The United States and Europe have, over the past decades, been so worried about being overrun by Mexicans and Turks, respectively, and yet today there is a more or less neutral kind of migration flow because Mexico is a fast-growing economy, as is Turkey. So the only cure is for people to want to go back to their countries when they're stable and fast-growing, and that's the repatriation phenomenon, voluntary, that is such a driver, actually, of growth across countries as they stabilize. You can see this in Colombia. You can see this, of course, China and India, with the hundreds of thousands of Chinese and Indians that have moved back over there. So there's only one cure in the long term.
I was thinking of the boat people just after the Vietnam War, and how there was global solidarity in coming together. And in fact, how the US and many other countries actually took percentages, and it was seen as a global shared responsibility. And you don't see that in the same way with this current wave of refugees. I think we have to differentiate, in a sense, economic migrants from those who are badly affected because of the collapse of their communities and because of the violence that they face in everyday life. I think with the economic migrants, both standing and receiving countries, in a sense, as well as transit countries, need to look at and see this as actually an economic strategy that will benefit as much as possible, and therefore to increase the safety of migration in such a way that people can use legal channels rather than actually fuel people smuggling as well as trafficking. In fact, this is not just a European problem. It was just a few months ago in May, it was a major problem in the Andaman Sea. And it's not just the Rohingyas because of the kind of discrimination that they face in Myanmar, but it was also the economic migrants from Bangladesh. And speaking to many of them, most of them went onto this whole criminal network mainly because they couldn't get jobs in the Middle East, and because of the complex situation in the Middle East, they were looking for other places. And of course, the country that they wanted to go to was Malaysia. And these problems that the way one region of the world can destabilize affects other region as well. So I think that at the end of the day, there could be three possible solution. One, of course, is to deal with the problem at its source, but that's more difficult because you can see how difficult it is even to deal with the Syrian crisis. It's to actually ensure that there is greater global solidarity in dealing with these problems. And the third one, actually, I think it will surprise a lot of people if we realize that 70% of the world's refugees happen to be in just a couple of countries, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey. And therefore, how do we make sure that those countries are also supported I think that these are some of the issues that are absolutely critical. So we have another 5 minutes. If there are any other
We still have
questions.
one
should
question
answer
not
that.
answered.
Yes, sorry. The one about
First, on the
maybe-
refugee, I agree with Parag that stability and the development is a solution. But the problem is that I'm not optimistic because the people who created those problems are not the ones who receiving or sending the refugees. I think that the Europe has not much say in the problem. And the Middle East are the ones who take all the punches. So in the long run, I think only when the Europe can stand up, say, look, not only we accept all those refugees, but we also have some influence, if not decisive influence, at least some influence in the Middle East. But now we see Americans, Russians are there. They don't take any refugees for now, but they created all troubles. And for the AIB, I would say that there are 57 members in the AIB. All of them going there to do business, not to tolerate any corruptions. So that's where the hope is. Of course, China has a 27% of the share. But the scenario can be this. If 4 European countries, together with either India or others, together, they can overrun Chinese resistance. So I think the Chinese leaders or Chinese themselves, they know better than anybody else. If AIB cannot be run as a business bank, there's no hope. They understand that. So therefore, the pressure from outside, from 56 countries, will be something over there, number one. Number two, of course, we have to give the doubt of benefits to Xi Jinping leadership, who is doing the best of anti-corruption. Anti-corruption, we know eventually is anti-monopoly in Chinese economy. So let's see.
Just to add, I would add that I think you can be guaranteed that the AIB will succeed, not only for the reasons that Jing has just mentioned, but also because to many people in this room, AIB may be something new, and it's a new name, but it's not a new phenomenon. China has spent the last 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union building infrastructural corridors and investments in its entire periphery, in every country that ends in stan, and it continues to do so. Were there not a continued demand for those investments, then you would not have the AIB either as an idea or as a reality such as it is today. It is at least the fourth incarnation of this infrastructural approach to dealing diplomatically and strategically with its neighbors over the last quarter century. And in each instance, the ambition has grown, the scale of the investments has grown, and the willingness of countries to cooperate with China has increased. So the AIB's success is more or less assured even before it's taken off. I can say that again from my own experience in all of those countries.
Well, we have 4 minutes left and 4 panelists, so I'm just going to give 1 minute to each panelist to reflect on what you would like the audience to take away. Maybe beginning with you, Professor Wang.
And I think we're facing the world that can be summarized by 2 words. The first word is integration, which is good news. No matter we talk about TPP or RCEP, One Belt, One Road, AIB, all those economic mechanisms are trying to get us together, not separate. The second word, of course, is uncertainty. There's so much uncertainties on today's world. So to overcome all those problems, as it depends on bilateral relationship between United States and China. I think if we have a stable relationship between United States and China, we are in good hands in a way that they will have to find a solution for all of this, or at least management of all those solutions, because US-China relationship has transcended the bilateral relationship. Whatever issue, if it's an issue between United States and China, will have a global implications. Whatever issue we face as human beings on this planet, without communication, consultation, and cooperation between the 2 largest powers, there's no way we can manage it, let alone solve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Luke?
Well, I would say that possibly the only good piece of geopolitical news for 2015 is the deal on Iran. And I'd say that one should really try and hang on to this, not just in terms of making sure that it doesn't get overturned or the people start walking away from it in direct or indirect ways, but to actually use the positive momentum of the big powers coming together on an issue of such complexity and significance, and extending this kind of cooperation in other fields, perhaps in Syria. Because obviously Syria is the deepest bleeding wound right now of international relations that is creating all kinds of difficulties, from the refugee to the continued fueling of ISIS and so on and so forth. Perhaps we can use the momentum, the goodwill that has come out of the Iranian deal to deal with other issues of the Middle East, starting with Syria. But what I would love to see in the possible attempt at cracking the Syria crisis, where China was not playing a front role in the Iran negotiations. It was at the table. It was very important that China was there as a permanent member of the Security Council, but it was kind of in the back seat. Perhaps China, as a growing factor, as a growing importance in international dealings, can play a more active role in this potential international approach towards resolving the Syria crisis.
Well, I want to take an optimistic view of the low commodities prices structurally. We tend to focus on those countries that are harmed as commodities exporters, but in the constructive spirit of the Milken Institute, I want to point to a theme that was present yesterday, which is the possibility of a real new investment super cycle. And I'd love to hear your view on this, James. But there are many countries, some of the most populous countries in the world, like India, Pakistan, Indonesia, that can use this opportunity, not to mention China, of course, to reduce subsidies, to fuel the kind of necessary infrastructure investments, urbanization, and so forth that are necessary to absorb their young populations and create jobs. So it's actually can be much more good news than bad news if we think about this opportunity to use low commodities prices to fuel a new infrastructure and investment super cycle. And that's the kind of language that I think we should be holding on to for the next 10 years, because the opportunity really began a couple of years ago and we shouldn't waste it.
James?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting idea, and we have seen a couple of countries do that, actually, some unexpected ones. So there's reason to be perhaps modestly optimistic on that. Sitting in London, we tend to spend a lot of our time worrying about Europe, and for the last several years, it's really been worrying about the Eurozone and the future of the Eurozone. But in some senses, when I look at Europe now, I worry more about the politics than the economics. And I think there are some powerful forces that are sort of pulling Europe apart. And I don't really see equally powerful forces kind of pulling Europe sort of back together again. And if you were to say a year ago, that Schengen would be suspended, that to be looking at border checks between Germany and Austria, you'd think that's mad. It's impossible. But here we are. That's kind of where we are. One of the consequences of the global financial crisis is really a political fragmentation in Europe that we haven't seen previously. And that fragmentation off to the left and the right often involves anti-establishment, which typically means anti-EU kind of parties moving forward. So there's a political sort of grassroots underpinning to sort of pulling the Eurozone apart as well. So I think there are reasons to be concerned about that, and and Grexit is certainly not off the table, nor is Brexit, the exit of the UK. So, as I said, there are a number of things kind of pushing Europe apart. It would be nice to see some countermeasures kind of pulling the whole thing back together again.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this panel, and I think you will agree with me that this has been a very intense and very interesting and rich discussion within the framework of an hour. So thank you to all the panelists and to all of you for participating.